Hey all, welcome to Parker's Reefs. In today's episode I'm going to give you a full tour and overview of my original and now 10-year-old reef aquarium and also explain why I financially cannot afford to shut it down. Alright, so let's go back 10 years, well before Parker's Reef ever existed, and in fact I'd never even kept an aquarium at all. Decided I wanted to get into the hobby, and after having a look at a couple of aquariums, looking at freshwater and looking at marine, I decided that marine was the way to go. Now, thankfully for me, this face is just not all about good looks. I decided to do a little bit of research and found out that saltwater tanks can be really difficult and really expensive. So before jumping in and spending a butt ton of money on a tank that I would then find out 3 months down the track I couldn't do, I decided to spend a little bit of money on a second-hand setup and try to keep the budget as low as possible, just basically to dip my toe in the water and see whether this hobby was for me. So I came across this RedSea Max 130 tank secondhand. I think it was for about $150 Australian, which at the time seemed like a lot of money, but I guess looking back now, it obviously was not that much money at all. And this tank 10 years later is still running and running really well. So the concept of buying this system was it was a well-known system. The RedSea Max 130 has got to be one of the most sold aquariums worldwide, or marine aquariums worldwide. It's incredibly popular. There's a huge community of support. Lots of people run them, lots of people modifying them, lots of people able to troubleshoot any problems you would have. And RedSea, of course, being a great brand, I knew that I was buying some quality bits of equipment here. So I picked this tank up for $150. The skimmer was not working. In fact, some of the parts were missing. The lights, I think they were working, but weren't great. It had the power compact tubes. The return pumps weren't, I think they were working, were just incredibly noisy. But it came with the cabinet, which was in a little bit of a shoddy condition, but it did come with the cabinet. The glass box itself looked to be in good shape. And one thing that I really liked at the time was it had a lid. I don't know why, it was just the style I wanted at the time. I didn't like the idea of an open aquarium. So picked this guy up and brought him home, and promptly went about making a few modifications because I guess even back then I liked to tinker with things. Maybe not on the same scale that I like to with my dream reef tank now, but I wanted to make this tank run as good as it can with the least amount of money possible. So I went about putting some modifications into it. I added a Tunzi return pump, which is fixed those really noisy old return pumps that are in there. I added a Turbo Floater Blue 500 skimmer, which I also picked up secondhand after researching to see that it would fit in to the back chamber of this tank. I also added an in-tank media chamber, which in fairness probably doesn't really get used at all anymore, but when I first set this aquarium up, I used to run a lot of medias and filter flosses and things in there, so it was really good at holding a bit of filter floss, a bag of Purigen and a bag of Chemi Pure, I guess, but I don't run any of that now. Maybe sometimes I put a bit of filter floss in there like I have for this video today, but the majority of the time there's no mechanical filtration whatsoever. After that, probably the biggest upgrade I did in this tank was pulling out the power compacts and putting in a retrofit LED kit from a company called Steve's LEDs. Now, these guys were really popular back in the day. I must admit, I had to go looking for their website as I was putting this video together because I wasn't sure if they're still around, but lo and behold, here they are. They are still about, and it's good to see that even though the product has gone through a few revisions, it appears to be much the same. And whilst I've never had any success growing SPS in this tank, I never really expected SPS to grow in here, this tank is just, it looks beautiful in my opinion. These lights have been growing all sorts of corals in here without any problems at all, from soft corals to Rhodactis to turbinarias, obviously anemones, all grow in here really, really well, and they just look beautiful. The colors these lights put out are really, really good. So that was a list of modifications, and to be honest, it hasn't really changed. The only thing that is changed or has been updated in the recent last 5 years, I guess, was I added a Tunzi 6040 wave maker, just so we got a little bit of extra flow, just because things get pretty grown in this system. And probably the one highest piece of tech on this tank, and probably is a huge credit to its long-term success, is an automatic water change. I have always put automatic water changes in this system for the last few years, and I have it go through about 20 litres a week, just to replicate the amount of water that I would manually do as a water change. When I have it linked in a daisy change into my other systems, it actually gets 20 litres a day, which is obviously way overkill, but it is second-hand water out of my other display systems. But at the moment, I've got it dialed back just to do 20 litres a week, and it gets its own water source just because I'm not doing auto water changes in my other systems at the moment. And the tank absolutely thrives along. Let's walk through some of the livestock now that I've covered all of the infrastructure of the system, and then I'll finish up by explaining how I simply cannot afford to shut this system down. So there's a few pieces of livestock in this tank, particularly some of the fish that are absolute family members, none more so than this big Ockie clownfish front and center there. That is Annie, the clownfish. She has been with us from the start, so she's been with me for 10 years, and she's called Annie because, again, keeping costs low, doing stuff that I would probably never do these days, but back then someone about an hour away said that they had a clownfish they were happy to give away, so rather than paying $30 for a captive bred clownfish at my local fish store, I decided to drive an hour each way to pick up a clownfish, and when I got there it was being held in a cup. I'm assuming the tank was sold, and let's just say Annie was angry. She went into this tank after it had cycled, all was well, put her in there, but man, she was angry. She used to bite me. She'd draw blood when she bit me, and she would just, whenever I put my hand in the tank, she would launch at me. One time had the lid up on its hinges, kind of like they do with car bonnets, I guess, and she launched at me and missed and bounced off the light into the back chamber, and I had to try and reach into the back chamber and get her out, which when she's biting you that hard it draws blood. It was kind of not the funnest thing ever, but thankfully for me, very shortly after Annie went in the tank, probably about probably 2 months, let's go, I added Klaus, the little male juvenile clown, and as soon as they paired up together, Annie's been an absolute sweetheart. She's not aggressive anymore. She obviously just needed a good man in her life, and she's a beautiful clownfish now. You can see she's always out and about. I mean, she does have a pretty frowny face, and she looks grumpy, but when you've had a fish in your family for 10 years, it's hard to imagine her not being in the house, and she's just a gorgeous little fish, so I really enjoy having Annie, and of course Klaus as well, but I mean, he does kind of take a little bit of a back seat to Annie. The two have bred a number of times. They've had a bunch of eggs laid that they raise up, and then eventually they just disperse into the system. I've never really tried to raise the eggs at all because I just simply don't have the time or resources to do it properly, but it is always nice when you see them getting along like that. Now, there are only two other fish in this system. They're a little bit more cryptic. I've got my bicolor blenny. In full disclosure, he's probably only been in there the last, I'd say maybe 3 or 4 years. I did have a lawnmower blenny in there before that went in as one of the original fish. Unfortunately, he passed. I'm not sure on the lifespan of blennies. I'm assuming it's longer than that, but the last 3 or 4 years it's been this bicolor blenny. Barely see him other than feeding time, but he's grown nicely. He went in nice and small, and now he's a decent sized fish. And last but not least is my captive bred orchid dottyback. Normally I don't recommend dottybacks at all, but it seems the captive bred orchid ones are fairly tame, and it's been no exception with the one in this system. The only thing, again, being it's a fairly cryptic fish. There's a lot of live rock in this system, and quite a lot of soft corals, and if the fish don't want to be seen, they aren't seen. So he lays pretty low most of the day, but he gets along fine with the most recent addition, which has been about a year now. That's the redline cleaner shrimp. That was given to me from my mate James, who shut down his reef system to build a mantis system, and obviously the cleaner shrimp was not going to get along with the mantis too well, so he gave me the mantis, he gave me the cleaner shrimp, and he fitted in the system really well. I was quite nervous that the orchid dottyback was going to smash him, but thankfully those two don't even really look at each other. In fact, I haven't really seen any fish other than the clowns go up for a clean. It's probably a good thing. I probably don't need the orchid dottyback going up for a clean in case sometimes they get a bit jittery and I wouldn't want one of them to get eaten. Alright, I guess we should talk corals in this tank because whilst there's nothing what I'd classify as overly ultra in this system, they're all pretty much bottom of the line cheap corals that were just chucked in here and left to do their thing. I really love the look of this tank and how it's ended up. These green Rhodactis started off as just one piece in there, and they've just spread their way around the whole tank, even up onto the back wall here now, where you can see it's even splitting into two on the back wall. They just completely dominate the tank sometimes, and other times they take a bit of a back seat to some of the other corals, and they're so bright and vibrant and so hardy as well. This system just gets very little attention, and they just always look on point. I guess there's a bit of an arm wrestle between them and obviously the anemones as to what's going to be dominating the tank, but also the leather offcuts, which were literally pieces I just hacked off with a Leatherman from my main display and dropped in here, and they take off and grow into weird and wonderful shapes. Also the clove polyps that are up here on the front glass, they sometimes they take over the tank a little bit as well. They normally grow up onto the glass. I just scrape them off, and then they're just back down onto the sand, but they do tend to get into the mix every now and then. I do have this beautiful turbinara here that I'm calling LA Lake, as it has these gorgeous yellow polyps that are just retracted a little bit at the moment due to the anemones climbing on it, but that piece was in my main display, and when I shut that main display down, that was one of the few pieces I did not want to sell. I put it into the holding system, and unfortunately it didn't do so well, so I chucked it in here as a bit of a Hail Mary, and to my surprise it's been doing really well, despite of course the anemones climbing on it. It just keeps growing and doing its thing. Other than that, there are a few bits and pieces in here that don't get as much attention. There's a gorgeous blue Tongan Rhodactis here, there's a couple of Zoas, some Ricks. Not quite sure what that is under there. We might just keep on moving. I've got some other lovely Rhodactis over here that just nice basic Superman, but this red one with yellow spots is something pretty special. And all in all, the tank is doing really, really well. It is quite a dynamic system in that depending on when you come in here, will depend on what coral is dominating the display. Sometimes it's the green Rhodactis, sometimes it's the anemones, sometimes it's the leather, sometimes it's the clove polyps. So the tank constantly kind of changes its look, which just keeps it fresh and interesting. Anyone with a keen, astute eye would have noticed that I do have a few pests in here. I've got a couple of big, large mother aptasias in there. There's also quite a few Asterina stars in there. To be honest, I don't worry too much about either of them. The aptasia hasn't taken off too bad. If it gets into a spot where I can inject it with some Aptasia X, I do. But otherwise I don't stress about it. Doesn't seem to bother the system too much. It hasn't taken off into anything crazy yet. And same with the Asterinas. I can see like one up on the glass in the back corner there. If he came a little bit further up, like if they were up here on the glass, I'd pull it out, but otherwise I tend not to bother with them. They don't seem to upset the corals that are in this system, so there's no need for me to upset them. All right, on to the burning question that it is, why I cannot afford to shut this tank down, why it means so much to me. Both, I guess we've covered emotionally, having a tank for 10 years and some of the inhabitants in there, they're like family now, but what is it about this super simple system that means I cannot afford to shut it down? And that is basically entirely because of these anemones in here. A few years ago now, I paid an absolute arm and a leg for a tiny little pup of one of those anemones, with the grand plans that I'm sure many people in the hobby have gone through before of deciding that I'm going to propagate these and make a killing. I know so many people that have done that with Zoas and Acros, and it normally goes well for a while, and then eventually things get out of hand or something goes wrong or whatever it is, and it just ends up being more hassle than it's worth. But I'm happy to say that these bubble tips have been the easiest thing ever to propagate. Whilst I paid an absolute fortune for one the size of my pinky nail, when I first put it into the tank a few years ago, they've reproduced really, really easily. I've never cut them, I just let them do their own thing, and I've sold a bunch of them for good money, and they have well and truly paid for the initial investment, probably 10 to 20 times over, as well as funding a lot of the rest of my hobby for the last couple of years. So even though the price of these bubble tip anemones has dropped quite a lot in the last maybe 6 to 12 months, they're still worth decent money each, and it's really cool to have one tank in my collection that actually not only carries its weight but it kind of helps out the rest of the team. In fact, this tank has the least amount of money spent on it, gets the least amount of love, yet it continually produces these little bubble tip anemones that just pave the way for me to spend big bucks on the rest of the tanks in my hobby. So I guess I owe a lot to this tank. It gave me the pathway into the hobby. It allowed me to form a beautiful connection with some of these incredible animals in here, probably none more so than Annie, who's been with me for 10 years. And last but not least, it's actually financially covered a lot of my expenses in the hobby over the last few years with these incredible bubble tip anemones. So that basically sums up why I cannot afford to shut this tank down. All right, guys, there you have it. That is the overview of my first ever aquarium, which was also my first ever reef aquarium, and I still have it to this day, 10 years later. And personally, I think it's never looked better, despite the fact there's nothing overly show-stopping in this tank. It gets everyone's attention whenever they come over. They're not interested in the automated tester. They're not interested in the top shelf, crazy, ultra export SBS frag. They love seeing the anemones. They love seeing the leathers, the soft corals all swaying with the flow, and the colors, and getting close to the fish is what really draws people's attention to this tank. And I have to admit, every time I come in the fish room, I love sitting in this chair and just spending a few minutes chatting away with my favorite fish. So I guess we're at the stage of the video where we'll wrap things up. If you've got any questions, comments, feedback about this tank, about the channel, anything in general, feel free to pop it in the comments section down below. Or if you just want to tell me about your first ever reef aquarium, I'd love to hear about your adventures and what you learned from your first ever tank, whether you were fortunate enough like I was to come across something that financially supported you to expand in the hobby, or whether it just financially drained you like a lot of people's first tanks do. I'd love to hear about it, so please reach out and pop your story in the comment section down below. I do personally read and respond to each and every comment down there, so rest assured I will see your stories, and I'd really appreciate to hear all about them. Other than that, guys, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. That lets YouTube algorithms know that it was a good video, and it will recommend it to other reefers, which will help us out on our other journey of reaching 25,000 subscribers. We're sitting around 16,000 right now, so we've got a little way to go. So if you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so. It costs no money at all. It takes 2 seconds of your time. Just click that button down in the bottom corner. All it'll do is let you know when I put out the next video, and it'll also go a long way to helping me out in this venture. Other than that, guys, I will leave it at that. Till next time, stay safe, keep reefing. Bye.